Thanks so much for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Beyond. Well, it is summer after all, which means it is approaching, in many cases, peak wildflower season. And after a really snowy winter and an exceptionally wet spring here in Colorado, I kind of want to get into what that might mean for the upcoming wildflower season here in Colorado, and also taking a look at that nationally, and also what leads to super blooms and wildflower blooms as well. So we're now joined by Jennifer Bousselot, an assistant professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture, for more about this. So, Jennifer, thanks so much for taking the time to join us and educate us here today.
It's my pleasure, Chris.
So, first of all, Jen, when it comes to these wildflowers, I think the term we often hear is a super bloom. So, I guess if you wouldn't mind by starting to explain what exactly a super bloom is, and is there an exact definition?
There is a definition. Superbloom is usually entirely encompassed by a solid mass of carpet of bloom. And there's all kinds of super blooms spread throughout the planet. The ones you're hearing about in the news right now are in California and Arizona, in those areas. In Colorado, we don't have the same types of species or the same type of spring conditions. So we're probably not going to have identical super blooms to those locations. However, we will see an abundance of our native wildflowers in bloom as well.
And what leads to those wildflowers blooming? You mentioned that we're going to have an abundance of them here in Colorado. What leads to that specific bloom?
Good question. The number one limiting factor is water. And when we have an abundance of water, that opens the door to the possibility of what we consider a super bloom in Colorado. Then there's other factors that come into play as well. It's not just water, but it's actually temperature. So if it's super cool for a certain elevation in Colorado, that's going to slow those plants down and not necessarily peak bloom. So what we kind of need is abundant moisture, but then also warmer temperatures and adequate sunshine in order to reach the super bloom conditions. Other things like a rapid decline in moisture over time can really slow those potential super blooms. So it's sort of like forecasting the weather. You know, you need to have these certain conditions in order to have, say, a tornado or a beautiful sunny day to happen. But there's other factors that can come into play that may actually influence that final outcome.
Okay, so I suppose what you mentioned, water being the number one source of what is needed for these wildflower blooms. We've obviously had a fairly good spring and going back to winter here in Colorado. Does that mean that we're looking at a pretty good bloom coming up here later on this summer?
Yes, it looks like that's the case. Now we've stayed extra cool, especially down in the Front Range, compared to what our normal temperatures are. So it's probably going to slow us down. We're seeing a much slower bloom rate, just anecdotally, with our plants than typical. So yes, we'll probably slow it down. And then as we increase in elevation, it's probably going to be even slower and slower. So for example, we have the Crested Butte Wildflower Festival, which is usually essentially a super bloom every summer. We will probably have that, but I suspect that our conditions are going to slow down that peak bloom, and it's not going to be the middle of July as usual. It's going to be closer to later just because of the cool temperatures.
Okay, so maybe more of a late July bloom. And you mentioned that depends on elevation. I would anticipate, this is just guessing off the top of my head, obviously you're the expert here, that at higher elevations you'll have a later bloom and at lower elevations you have an earlier one. Is that how it works?
Yes, that's correct. And in Colorado, on the Front Range, we usually see, especially in our gardens, peak bloom about mid-June. We didn't necessarily see that just because of the cool, damp conditions. So we're expecting a couple of week delay potentially on peak blooms for wildflowers. And so as you go up in elevation, it moves back a week or two for every few thousand feet in elevation.
Okay. So I guess that's here in Colorado. Let's say you've seen the maroon bells, you've seen some of those hot spots here in Colorado. What are other locations? You mentioned California, Arizona. What are some unique wildflowers in other parts of the country that you might recommend? And also, how are those places looking for their peak?
So they most of the super bloom has already passed in most of those locations because they're further south and lower elevation. So I don't think we're going to see a lot more. It's going to move much more north. So it would probably be Nevada and other places like that if they received a lot of moisture that would be going through a similar super bloom. The unique thing about that area of the US and why they have so many super blooms after a wet spring is they have a series of plants that we call ephemeral annuals. So they only come once a year if the conditions are ideal. And they bloom, 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 and set seed, and they may lay dormant for years after.
Hmm.
In Colorado, our conditions are so much more extreme in terms of winter temperatures that we don't have as many of those. Most of our plants are perennial, so they come back every year. And so they're a little bit more conservative in their showy bloom, but they have a tendency to bloom more in those wetter seasons.
Jennifer, you mentioned some of those different kinds of species of wildflowers that we have. Does Colorado have any specific ones that are unique only to Colorado, or do we share those specific kinds of species with other states or other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have 3,211 Colorado native plants.
Wow.
That's, yeah, documented by our current botanical authority on that. Um, and a fraction of those, only a couple hundred, are what we call endemic. So they're native only to Colorado or to like a border area of Colorado, a small location. Thankfully, we actually share a lot of the genus names, like a bunch of the plants that are in my background. You'll find close relatives of those in other areas of the US and even on other continents. But we do have a sort of unique mix, and we have incredibly high diversity of plants in our state, mostly because we have so many different locations that plants thrive in, from a semi-arid desert-like condition all the way to the alpine.
Fascinating indeed. Some things I certainly didn't consider there. So I guess when it comes to maybe seeing some of those here in Colorado, I think, again, I mentioned this, if you're new to Colorado, the maroon bells are quite famous in particular for their blooms in mid to late July, as you mentioned there, Jennifer. What are some off the beaten path sort of wildflower flower areas where we might be able to see some beautiful displays that, again, people might not necessarily think about?
Absolutely. So one of the best places to see wildflowers is near Gothic, Colorado. So that's just up the mountain from Crested Butte. The Gunnison area will also have all kinds of excellent wildflowers right now. The San Juan Mountains near Durango, and specifically the San Juans, have incredible diversity in their national forest there. Another couple of excellent places that I like to hike are around Steamboat Springs near Rabbit Ears Pass, and then near Granby, so on the far side from the Front Range of the Rocky Mountain National Park. So some of those areas are extremely rich in wildflowers, and you don't necessarily find a lot of folks to meet you on the path.
Hmm.
Two more that came to mind was actually the reservoir around Gunnison and the Western Slope right on the Grand Mesa. There's incredible wildflowers.
So that's a pretty good geographic scope. You're talking about Durango, the Western Slope, Steamboat Springs, Granby. That covers a pretty good chunk of the mountains. Is there anywhere in particular that may be a personal favorite for you, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, of course. So it always comes down to like experience, right? And my absolute favorite is actually the Schofield Pass hike. That's just north of Gothic, a little higher up in the mountains. You're actually really close to Aspen, believe it or not. And I had an absolutely enchanting hike there once that I'll never forget. I go to when I need a moment of respite. I go back to that location. So I highly recommend that location for wildflower viewing.
That's awesome. I guess any other big things we should know about with wildflowers, super blooms, how it works, and maybe a bit more specific to how it works here in Colorado?
Totally. So the number one thing with super blooms is it's so thrilling to see it, but if you can please leave those plants in place, that really helps because a lot of times people love to like pick that flower because that's a beautiful color that they don't see anywhere else. But we want to maintain genetic diversity of those species in there. So let them be in place. Another fun thing is to observe. So go and look closely at those flowers and see what pollinators there are. We have 946 species of bees that are native to Colorado. And I bet you'll find a large number of them by just going in and observing their pollination practices. Believe it or not, there's all kinds of beetles and flies and butterflies and hummingbirds that pollinate as well. And just look at it as an entire system because it is absolutely unique to our environment to have such high diversity and such a unique thriving ecosystem really within a couple hours of where most of the people in Colorado live. And so enjoy that and please help us respect and conserve it.
So don't pick the flowers and kind of respect nature and leave it at its place. But this is certainly fascinating, Jennifer. I appreciate a few minutes of your time and for you lending us your expertise about this. And this is again very, very interesting to me. And again, you kind of highlighted there a second ago that Colorado has so many different unique parts about its geography, but it also lends to quite a few unique species, and specifically wildflowers.
Yes, we really are a treasure trove in so many ways. It's not just the great outdoors, but man, the other species that share our space are pretty incredible to watch as well.
I feel pretty lucky to live here, but no doubt about that. And Jennifer Bousselot, an assistant professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture. Appreciate a few minutes of your time. And again, thanks for educating us here today.
My pleasure, Chris.